October 1940. Man that is born of woman hath but a short time to live, and is full of misery. He cometh up and is cut down like a flower, he fleet as it were a shadow, and never continueth in one stay. A light drizzle was falling. Ursula felt an urge to take out her handkerchief, and wipe the wet coffin lid. On the other side of the open grave, Pamela and Bridget were pillars, holding up Sylvie, who seemed to be so consumed with her grief that she could barely stand. Ursula felt her own heart harden and contract with every sob that issued from her mother's chest. Sylvie had been needlessly unkind to Hugh in the last months, and now this great affliction seemed like a show. "You're too harsh," Pamela said. "No one can understand what goes on in a marriage, every couple is different." Jimmy, shipped to North Africa the previous week, had been unable to get compassionate leave, but Teddy had turned up at the last minute. Shiningly smart in uniform, he had returned from Canada with his wings like an angel, Bridget said, and was stationed in Lincolnshire. He and Nancy clung to each other at the committal. Nancy was vague about her job, clerical really, and Ursula thought she recognized the fudge of the Official Secrets Act at work. The church was packed, most of the village turned out for Hugh, and yet there was something odd about the funeral, as if the guest of honor hadn't been able to come. Which he hadn't, of course. Hugh wouldn't have wanted a fuss. He had once said to her, "Oh, you can just put me out with the dustbin, I won't mind." The service had been the usual sort, reminiscences and commonplaces, salted with a hefty dose of Anglican doctrine, although Ursula was surprised at how well the vicar seemed to be acquainted with Hugh. Major Shawcross read from the Beatitudes, rather movingly, and Nancy read one of Mr. Todd's favorite poems, which surprised all the women of his family who didn't know that Hugh had any inclination towards poetry. Nancy had a nice speaking voice, better actually than Millie's, which was overly thespian. Robert Louis Stevenson, Nancy said. Perhaps appropriate for these testing times. Tempest tossed and sore afflicted, sin defiled and care oppressed, come to me, all ye that labor, come, and I will give ye rest. Fear no more, O doubting hearted, weep no more, O weeping eye. Lo, the voice of your Redeemer, lo, the songful morning near. Here 1 hour you toil and combat, sin and suffer, bleed and die, in my Father's quiet mansion soon to lay your burden by. Bear a moment, heavy laden, weary hand and weeping eye. Lo, the feet of your deliverer, lo, the hour of freedom here. Tosh, really, Pamela whispered, but oddly comforting tosh. At the graveside, Izzy murmured, I feel as if I'm waiting for something dreadful to happen, and then I realize it already has. Izzy had arrived back from California just a few days before Hugh died. She had flown, rather admirably, on a taxing Pan Am flight from New York to Lisbon, and from there with BOAC to Bristol. I saw 2 German fighter planes from the window, she said, I swear I thought they were going to attack us. She had decided, she said, that as an Englishwoman it was wrong to be sitting out the war amid the orange groves. All that lotus eating wasn't for her, she said, although Ursula would have said it was exactly her. She had hoped, like her husband the famous playwright, to be asked to write screenplays for the film industry, but had received only one offer, some silly costume drama that had been aborted before it left the page. Ursula got the impression that Izzy's script hadn't come up to scratch, too witty. She had continued with Augustus, however, Augustus goes to war, Augustus and the salvage hunt and so on. It didn't help, Izzy said, that the famous playwright was surrounded by Hollywood starlets, and that he was shallow enough to find them fascinating. In truth, we simply grew bored with each other, she said. All couples do eventually, it's inevitable. Izzy was the one who had found Hugh. He was in a deck chair on the lawn. The wicker furniture had long since rotted and been replaced by the more quotidian deck chair. Hugh had been put out by the arrival of folding wood and canvas. He would have preferred the wicker chaise longue for a beer. Ursula's thoughts were full of such inconsequences. Easier to deal with, she thought, than the bare fact that Hugh was dead. I thought he was asleep out there, Sylvie said. So I didn't disturb him. A heart attack, the doctor said. He looked peaceful, Izzy said to Ursula. As if he didn't really mind going. Ursula felt that he probably minded very much, but that was no comfort to either of them. She had little conversation with her mother. Sylvie seemed always to be on the point of leaving the room. I can't settle, she said. She was wearing an old cardigan of Hugh's. I'm cold, she said. I'm so cold, like someone in shock. Miss Wolfe would have known what to do with Sylvie. Hot sweet tea probably, and some kind words, but neither Ursula nor Izzy felt like offering either. Ursula sensed they were being rather vengeful, but they had their own distress to nurse. I'll stay on with her for a while, Izzy said. Ursula thought this was a terrible idea, and wondered if Izzy wasn't just avoiding the bombs. You'd better get yourself a ration book then, Bridget said. You're eating us out of house and home. Bridget had been very affected by Hugh's death. Ursula came across her crying in the pantry and said, I'm awfully sorry, as if the loss were Bridget's, not hers. Bridget wiped her tears vigorously on her apron and said, must get on with the tea. Ursula herself stayed only 2 more days, and spent most of the time helping Bridget to sort out Hugh's things. I can't, Sylvie said, I just can't. Neither can I, Izzy said. Then it's you and me, Bridget said to Ursula. Hugh's clothes were so very real it seemed absurd that the man who had worn them had disappeared. Ursula took a suit out of the wardrobe and held it against her body. If Bridget hadn't taken it from her and said, that's a good suit, someone will be grateful for it, she might have crawled into the wardrobe and given up on life. Bridget's feelings were now locked up tightly, thank goodness. There was a great deal to be said for fortitude in the face of tragedy. Certainly her father would have approved. They parceled Hugh's clothes up in brown paper and string, and the milkman put them on his cart, and took them round to the WVS. Izzy's grief had left her wide open. She trailed around the house after Ursula, trying to conjure up Hugh from memories. They were all doing that, Ursula supposed. It was so impossible to grasp that he had gone forever that they had all started trying to reconstitute him out of thin air, Izzy most of all. I can't remember the last thing he said to me, Izzy said. Or what I said to him, for that matter. It won't make any difference, Ursula said wearily. Whose bereavement was the greater after all, the daughter or the sister? But then she thought of Teddy. Ursula tried to remember what her own last words to her father had been. A nonchalant see you later, she concluded. The final irony. We never know when it will be the last time, she said to Izzy, platitudinous, even to her own ears. She had seen so much of other people's distress by now that she was numb to it. Except for that one moment when she held his suit, she thought of it, ridiculously, as her wardrobe moment. She had put Hugh's death away in some quiet place to be taken out later and considered. Perhaps when everyone else had done talking. And the thing is, Izzy said, please, Ursula said. I've got an awful headache. Ursula was collecting eggs from the nest boxes when Izzy mooched into the hen house. The chickens were clucking restlessly, they seemed to miss Sylvie's attentions, the mother hen. The thing is, Izzy said, there's something I'd like to tell you. Oh? Ursula said, distracted by a particularly broody hen. I had a baby. What? I'm a mother, Izzy said, seemingly unable to resist sounding dramatic. You had a baby in California. No, Izzy laughed. Years ago. I was just a child myself. 16. I had him in Germany. I was sent abroad in disgrace, as you can imagine. A boy. Germany? And he was adopted. Yes. Well, more like given away. Hugh saw to it all, so I'm sure he found a very good family. But he made him a hostage to fortune, didn't he? Poor Hugh, he was such a rock at the time, mother would have nothing to do with it. But that's the thing, he must have known the name, where they lived, etc. The hens were making a dreadful racket now, and Ursula said, let's get out of here. I always thought, Izzy said, taking Ursula's arm and walking her round to the lawn, that one day I would talk to Hugh about what he did with the baby and then perhaps try and find him. My son, she added, trying out the word as if for the first time. Tears started to roll down her face. For once, her emotions seemed from the heart. And now Hugh's gone and I'll never be able to find the baby. He's not a baby, of course, he's the same age as you. Me? Ursula said, trying to grasp this idea. Yes. But he's the enemy. He might be up there in the sky. They both automatically glanced up at the blue autumn sky, empty of friend and foe alike, or fighting in the forces. He might be dead, or going to die if this wretched war goes on. Izzy was sobbing openly now. He might have been brought up as a Jew, for God's sake. Hugh wasn't an anti-Semite, quite the opposite, he was great friends with your neighbor, what's his name? Mr. Cole. You do know what's happening to the Jews in Germany, don't you? Oh, for heaven's sake, Sylvie said, materializing suddenly like a bad fairy. What are you making such a fuss about? You should come back to London with me, Ursula said to Izzy. The Luftwaffe's bombs would be more straightforward for her to deal with than Sylvie. November 1940. Miss Wolfe was treating them to a little piano recital. Some Beethoven, she said. I'm no Myra Hess, but I thought it would be nice. She was correct on both counts. Mr. Armitage, the opera singer, asked Miss Wolfe if she could accompany him if he sang Non più andrai from The Marriage of Figaro, and Miss Wolfe, particularly game this evening, said she would certainly have a go. It was a rousing performance, unexpectedly virile, was Miss Wolfe's verdict, and no one objected when Mr. Bullock, no surprise, and Mr. Sims, quite a surprise, joined in with a rather ribald version. I know this one, Stella said, which was true of the tune, but not the words as she sang enthusiastically, dum-de-dum, dum-de-dum, dum-di-dum-dum, and so on. Their post had recently been augmented by 2 wardens. The first, Mr. Emsley, was a grocer and had come from another post, having been bombed out of his house, his shop and his sector. He, like Mr. Sims and Mr. Palmer before him, was a veteran of the previous war. The second edition was in possession of a more exotic background. Stella was one of Mr. Bullock's chorus girls and confessed, readily, to being a striptease artiste, but Mr. Armitage the opera singer said, "We're all artistes here, darling." "What a bloody fairy that man is," Mr. Bullock muttered, "put him in the army, that would sort him out." "I doubt it," Miss Wolfe said. And it did rather beg the question why the strapping Mr. Bullock himself had not been called up for active service. So Mr. Bullock concluded, "We've got a yid, a pansy and a tart, sounds like a dirty music hall joke." "It is intolerance that has brought us to this pass, Mr. Bullock," Miss Wolfe reproved him mildly. They had all been decidedly tetchy, even Miss Wolfe, since Mr. Palmer's death. They would be better off saving their grudges for peacetime, Ursula thought. It wasn't just Mr. Palmer's death, of course, but also the lack of sleep and the relentless nightly raids. How long could the Germans keep it up? Forever? And, oh, I don't know, Miss Wolfe said quietly to her as she made tea, it's just the general sense of dirtiness, as if one will never be clean again, as if poor old London will never be clean again. Everything is so awfully shabby, you know. It was a relief, therefore, that their little impromptu concert party was good-natured, everyone seemingly in better spirits than of late. Mr. Armitage followed his Figaro with an unaccompanied and impassioned rendition of O mio babbino caro. How versatile he is, Miss Wolfe said. I always thought that was a woman's aria, that they all applauded wildly. Then Herr Zimmermann, their refugee, said he would be honored to play something for them. And then are you going to strip, sweetheart? Mr. Bullock asked Stella, who said, if you want, and winked in complicity at Ursula. Trust me to get stuck with a load of Bolshe women, Mr. Bullock complained. Frequently. Miss Wolfe said, looking worried, your violin is here, to Herr Zimmermann. Is it safe here? He had never brought his instrument to the post before. It was quite valuable, Miss Wolfe said, and not just from a monetary point of view, for he had left his entire family behind in Germany, and the violin was all he had from his former life. Miss Wolf said that she had had a harrowing late-night chat with Herr Zimmermann about the situation in Germany. Things are terrible over there, you know. I know, Ursula said. Do you? Miss Wolf said, her interest piqued. Do you have friends there? No, Ursula said. No one. Sometimes one just knows, doesn't one? Herr Zimmermann produced his violin and said, "You must forgive me, I am not a soloist," and then announced, almost apologetically, Bach. Sonata in G minor. It's funny, isn't it, Miss Wolf whispered in Ursula's ear, how much German music we listen to. Great beauty transcends all. Perhaps after the war it will heal all too. Think of the choral symphony, Alle Menschen werden Brüder. Ursula didn't answer as Herr Zimmermann had raised his bow, poised for performance, and a deep hush fell, as if they were in a concert hall rather than a rundown post. Some of the silence was due to the quality of the performance, sublime, Miss Wolf judged it later. Really beautiful, Stella said, and some out of respect perhaps for Herr Zimmermann's refugee status, but there was also something so spare about the music that it left plenty of room for one to engage deeply with one's thoughts. Ursula found herself dwelling on Hugh's death, his absence more than his death. It was only a fortnight since he died, and she was still expecting to see him again. These were the thoughts she had put away for a future time, and now the future was suddenly on her. She was relieved not to be embarrassed by tears, instead she was plunged into an awful melancholy. As if sensing her emotions, Miss Wolf reached out and gripped her hand firmly. Ursula could feel that Miss Wolf herself was almost vibrating with emotion. When the music finished there was a moment of pure, profound silence, as if the world had stopped breathing, and then instead of praise and applause the piece was broken by the purple warning bombers within 20 minutes. It was rather odd to think that these alerts were coming from her own Region 5 war room, sent by the girls in the teleprinter room. Come on then, Mr. Sims said, standing up and sighing heavily, let's get out there. By the time they were out the red alert had come through. Just 12 minutes, if they were lucky, to dragoon people into shelters, the siren at their back. Ursula never used public shelters, there was something about the crush of bodies, the claustrophobia, that made her skin crawl. They had attended a particularly gruesome incident, when a shelter took a direct hit from a parachute mine in their sector. Ursula thought that she would rather die out in the open than trapped like a fox in a hole. It was a beautiful evening. A crescent moon and her bevy of stars had pierced the black backcloth of night. She thought of Romeo's encomium to Juliet, it seems she hangs upon the cheek of night as a rich jewel in an Ethiop's ear. Ursula was in a poetic mood, some might have said, herself included, overly poetic, as a consequence of her mournful mood. There was no Mr. Durkin to misquote any more. He had suffered a heart attack during an incident. He was recovering, thank goodness, Miss Wolf said. She had found time to visit him in hospital and Ursula felt no guilt that she had not. Hugh was dead, Mr. Durkin wasn't, there was little room in her heart for sympathy. Mr. Dickens' position as Miss Wolf's deputy had been taken by Mr. Sims. The strident noises of war had begun. The boom of the barrage, the raiders' engines overhead with that monotonous, uneven beat that made her nauseous. The gun discharges, the searchlights poking their fingers into the sky, the muted anticipation of dread, all soon spoiled any idea of poetry. By the time they arrived at the incident everyone was there, the gas and water, the bomb disposal squad, heavy rescue, light rescue, stretcher parties, the mortuary van, a baker's van by day. The road was carpeted with the tangled hoses of an AFS unit, as on one side of the street a building was well on fire, with sparks and burning embers spitting out. Ursula thought she had caught a glimpse of Fred Smith, his features briefly illuminated by the flames, but came to the conclusion that she had imagined it. The rescue squad was as cautious as ever with their torches and lamps even though the fire was blazing away at their backs. Yet to a man, they had cigarettes hanging from the corners of their mouths, despite the fact that the gas men hadn't cleared the area, not to mention that the presence of the bomb disposal squad indicated a bomb that might go off at any moment. Everyone just got on with the job in hand, needs must, cavalier in the face of possible disaster. Or perhaps some people, and Ursula wondered if she included herself among them nowadays, simply didn't care anymore. She had an uncomfortable feeling, a premonition perhaps, that things were not going to go well tonight. It was the Bach, Miss Wolf comforted, it was unsettling for the soul. Apparently, the street straddled two sectors and the incident officer in charge was wrangling with two wardens who both claimed dominion over it. Miss Wolf didn't join this little fracas as it turned out that it wasn't their sector at all, but as it was obviously such a major incident she declared that their post should pitch in, and get on with it and ignore what anyone said to them. Outlaws, Mr. Bullock said, appreciatively. Hardly, Miss Wolf said. The half of the street that wasn't on fire had been badly hit, and the acid-raw smell of powdered brick and cordite struck their lungs immediately. Ursula tried to think of the meadow at the back of the copse at Fox Corner. Flax and larkspur, corn poppies, red campion, and oxeye daisies. She thought of the smell of new-mown grass and the freshness of summer rain. This was a new diversionary tactic to combat the brutish sense of an explosion. Does it work? A curious Mr. Emsley asked. Not really, Ursula said. I used to think of my mother's perfume, Miss Wolf said. April violets. But unfortunately now, when I try to remember my mother, all I can think of are the bombs. Ursula offered Mr. Emsley a peppermint. It helps a little bit, she said. The closer they got to the incident, the worse it proved to be. The opposite, in Ursula's experience, was rarely so. A grisly tableau was the first thing to greet them. Mangled bodies were strewn around, many of them no more than limbless torsos, like tailor's dummies, their clothes blown off. Ursula was reminded of the mannequins she had seen with Ralph in Oxford Street, after the John Lewis bomb. A stretcher-bearer, lacking as yet any live casualties, was picking up limbs, arms and legs that were sticking out of the rubble. He looked as if he was intending to piece the dead together again at a later date. Did someone do that? Ursula wondered. In the mortuaries, try and match people up like macabre jigsaws. Some people were beyond recreation, of course. Two men from the rescue squad were raking and shoveling lumps of flesh into baskets, another was scrubbing something off a wall with a yard brush. Ursula wondered if she knew any of the victims. Their flat in Philly-Moore Gardens was a mere couple of streets away from here. Perhaps she passed some of them in the morning on her way to work, or had spoken to them in the grocer's or the butcher's. Apparently there are quite a lot of people unaccounted for, Miss Wolf said. She had spoken to the incident officer, who had been grateful, it seemed, to talk to a warden with common sense. We're not outlaws anymore, you'll be pleased to hear. One floor above the man with the yard brush, although there was no floor, a dress was hanging on a coat hanger from a picture rail. Ursula often found herself more moved by these small reminders of domestic life, the kettle still on the stove, the table laid for a supper that would never be eaten, than she was by the greater misery and destruction that surrounded them. Although when she looked at the dress now she realized that there was a woman still wearing it, her head and legs blown off but not her arms. The capriciousness of high explosives never ceased to surprise Ursula. The woman seemed to have become fused with the wall in some way. The fire was burning so brightly that she could make out a little brooch still pinned to the dress. A black cat, a rhinestone for an eye. Rubble shifted underfoot as she made her way to the back wall of this same house. There was a woman sitting propped up amongst the rubble, arms and legs splayed like a rag doll. She looked as if she had been tossed in the air and landed any old how, which was probably the case. Ursula tried to signal to the stretcher-bearer, but there was now a stream of bombers passing overhead, and no one could hear her above the noise. The woman was gray with dust so that it was almost impossible to tell how old she was. She had a horrible-looking burn on her hand. Ursula fumbled in her first aid pack for the tube of Bernal, and smeared some of the ointment onto her hand. She didn't know why, the woman looked too far gone to be cured by Bernal. She wished she had some water, it was painful to see how dry the woman's lips were. Unexpectedly, she opened her dark eyes, her lashes pale and spiky with dust, and tried to say something, but her voice was so hoarse from the dust that Ursula couldn't understand her. Was she foreign? What is it? Ursula asked. She had a feeling the woman was very near death now. Baby, the woman rasped suddenly, where's my baby? Baby? Ursula echoed, looking around. She could see no sign of any baby. It could be anywhere in the rubble. His name, the woman said, guttural and indistinct, she was making a tremendous effort to be lucid, is Emile. Emile. The woman nodded her head very slightly, as if she were no longer capable of speech. Ursula looked around again for any sign of a baby. She turned back to the woman to ask how big her baby was, but her head was lolling limply, and when Ursula felt for a pulse she found nothing. She left the woman there and went in search of the living. Can you take Mr. Emsley a morphia tablet? Miss Wolfe asked. They could both hear a woman screaming and swearing like a navvy, and Miss Wolfe added, to the lady that's making all the noise. A good rule of thumb was that the more noise someone was making, the less likely they were to die. This particular casualty sounded as if she were ready to fight her way out single-handed from the wreckage of the house and run round Kensington Gardens. Mr. Emsley was in the cellar of the house, and Ursula had to be lowered down by 2 men from the rescue squad, and then had to worm her way through a barricade of joists and bricks. She was aware that an entire house appeared to be resting precariously on this same barricade. She found Mr. Emsley stretched out almost horizontally next to a woman. Below the waist she was completely trapped by the wreckage of the house, but she was conscious and extremely articulate about the distress she was in. Soon have you out of here, Mr. Emsley said. Get you a nice cup of tea, eh? How does that sound? Lovely, eh? Fancy one myself. And here's Miss Todd with something for the pain, he continued soothingly to her. Ursula passed him the tiny morphia tablet. He seemed very good at this. It was hard to imagine him in his grocer's apron, weighing sugar and patting butter. One wall of the cellar had been sandbagged, but most of the sand had spilled out in the explosion, and for an alarming hallucinatory second Ursula was on a beach somewhere, she didn't know where. A hoop was bowling along beside her in a brisk breeze, seagulls squawking overhead, and then she was back, just as suddenly, in the cellar. Lack of sleep, she thought, it really was the devil. About fucking time, the woman said, greedily taking the morphia tablet. You'd think you lot were at a fucking tea party. She was young, Ursula realized, and oddly familiar. She was clutching her handbag, a large black affair, as if it were keeping her afloat in the sea of timber. Have you got a fag, either of you? With some difficulty, given the awkward space they were in, Mr. Emsley produced a squashed packet of players from his pocket and then, with even more difficulty, extracted a box of matches. Her fingers tapped restlessly on the leather of the bag. Take your time, she said sarcastically. Sorry, she said after she had drawn deeply on the cigarette. Being in an android like this has an effect on the nerves, you know. Renee. Ursula said, astonished. What's it to you, she said, returning to her former churlish self. We met in the cloakroom at the Charing Cross Hotel a couple of weeks ago. I think you've mistaken me for someone else, she said primly. People are always doing that. I must have one of those faces. She took another very long drag on her cigarette, and then exhaled slowly, and with extraordinary pleasure. You got any more of those little pills, she asked. Good black market price for them, I bet. She sounded woozy, the morphia kicking in, Ursula supposed, but then the cigarette dropped from her fingers and her eyes rolled back in her head. She started to convulse. Mr. Emsley grabbed hold of her hand. Ursula, glancing at Mr. Emsley, caught sight of a color reproduction of Malay's bubbles, hanging by a piece of tape from a sandbag behind him. It was a picture she disliked all the pre-Raphaelites with their droopy, drug-looking women. Hardly the time and place for art criticism, she thought. She had become almost indifferent to death. Her soft soul had crystallized. Just as well, she thought. She was a sword tempered in the fire. And again she was somewhere else, a little flicker in time. She was descending a staircase, wisteria was blooming, she was flying out of a window. Mr. Emsley was talking encouragingly to Renee. Come on, Susie, don't give up on us now. We'll have you out of here in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail, you'll see. All the lads are working on it. And the girls, he added for Ursula's benefit. Renee had stopped convulsing, but now she started to shiver alarmingly, and Mr. Emsley, more urgently now, said, Come on, Susie, come on, girl, stay awake, there's a good girl. Her name is Renee, Ursula said, even if she denies it. I call all Susie, Mr. Emsley said softly. I had a little girl by that name. The diphtheria took her off when she was just a little un. Renee gave one last great shudder, and life disappeared from her half-open eyes. Gone, Mr. Emsley said sadly. Internal injuries probably. He wrote Argyle Road on a label in his neat grocer's hand, and tied it to her finger. Ursula removed the handbag from Renee's rather reluctant grasp and shook its contents out. Her identity card, she said, holding it up for Mr. Emsley to see. Renee Miller, it said, indisputably. He added her name to the label. While Mr. Emsley began the complex maneuver of turning round in order to make his way back out of the cellar, Ursula picked up the gold cigarette case that had fallen out with the compact and lipstick and French letters and God knows what else that formed the contents of Renee's handbag. Not a gift but stolen property, she was sure of that. It was a difficult task for Ursula's imagination to place Renee and Crichton in the same room as each other, let alone the same bed. War did indeed make strange bedfellows of people. He must have picked her up in a hotel somewhere, or perhaps a less salubrious endroit. Where had she learned her French? She probably only had a couple of words. Not from Crichton anyway, he thought English was quite enough to rule the world with. She slipped the cigarette case and the identity card into a pocket. The debris shifted in a heart-stopping way, as they were trying to back out of the cellar. They'd given up on trying to turn round. They remained paralyzed, crouched like cats, hardly daring to take a breath for what seemed an eternity. When it felt safe to move again, they found that this new arrangement of wreckage had made the barricade impenetrable, and they were forced to find another, tortuous exit, creeping on their hands and knees through the shattered base of the building. Doing my back in, this lark is, Mr. Emsley muttered behind her. Doing my knees in, Ursula said. They carried on with weary doggedness. Ursula cheered herself up with the thought of buttered toast, although Phillimore Gardens was out of butter, and unless Millie had gone out and queued, unlikely, there was no bread either. The cellar seemed to be an endless maze, and it slowly dawned on Ursula why there were people unaccounted for up above. They were all secretly cached down here. The residents of the house clearly used this part of the cellar as a shelter. The dead here, men, women, children, even a dog, looked as though they had been entombed where they had been sitting. They were completely cloaked in a shell of dust and looked more like sculptures or fossils. She was reminded of Pompeii or Herculaneum. Ursula had visited both, during her ambitiously titled Grand Tour of Europe. She had been lodged in Bologna, where she had made friends with an American girl, Kathy, a gung-ho type, and they had taken a whistle-stop tour, Venice, Florence, Rome, Naples, before Ursula left for France and the final leg of her year abroad. In Naples, a city that frankly terrified them, they hired a loquacious private guide and spent the longest day of their lives trudging determinedly round the dry, dusty ruins of the lost cities of the Roman Empire beneath a merciless southern sun. Oh gosh, Kathy said as they staggered around a deserted Herculaneum, I wish no one had ever gone to the bother of digging em up. Their friendship had flared brightly for a short time, and fizzled out just as quickly when Ursula went to Nancy. I have spread my wings and learned how to fly, she wrote to Pamela after leaving Munich and her hosts, the Brenners. I am quite the sophisticated woman of the world, although she was still little more than a fledgling. If the year had taught her one thing, it was that after having endured a succession of private students, the last thing she wanted to do was teach. Instead, on her return, with an eye to entrance into the civil service, she did an intensive shorthand and typing course in High Wycombe, run by a Mr. Carver who was later arrested for exposing himself in public. A meat flasher, Maurice said, his lip curling in disgust, and Hugh shouted at him to leave the room, and never to use such language in his house again. Infantile, he said when Maurice had slammed his way out into the garden. Is he really fit for marriage? Maurice had come home to announce his engagement to a girl called Edwina, the eldest daughter of a bishop. Goodness, Sylvie said, will we have to genuflect or something? Don't be ridiculous, Maurice said, and Hugh said, how dare you speak to your mother like that? It was a terrifically bad-tempered visit all round. Mr. Carver hadn't been such a bad sort really. He had been very keen on Esperanto, which had seemed an absurd eccentricity at the time, but now Ursula thought it might be a good thing to have a universal language, as Latin had once been. Oh yes, Miss Wolfe said, a common language was a wonderful idea, but utterly utopian. All good ideas were, she said sadly. Ursula had embarked for Europe a virgin, but didn't return one. She had Italy to thank for that. Well, if one can't take a lover in Italy, where can one take one? Milly said. He, Johnny, was studying for a doctorate in philology at Bologna University, and was more grave and serious than Ursula had expected an Italian to be. In Bridget's romantic novels, Italians were always dashing but untrustworthy. Johnny brought a studious solemnity to the occasion, and made the rite of passage less embarrassing and awkward than she had feared. Gosh, Cathy said, you are bold. She reminded Ursula of Pamela. In some ways, not in others, not in her serene denial of Darwin, for example. Cathy, a Baptist, was saving herself for marriage, but a few months after she returned to Chicago her mother wrote to Ursula to tell her that Cathy had died in a boating accident. She must have gone through her daughter's address book and written to everyone in it, one by one. What an awful task. For Hugh, they had simply put a notice in the Times. Poor Cathy had saved herself for nothing. The grave's a fine and private place, but none I think do their embrace. Miss Todd. Sorry, Mr. Emsley. It's like being in a crypt, isn't it? Full of the ancient dead. Yes, and I'd quite like to get out before I turn into one of them. As she crept gingerly forward, Ursula's knee pressed on something soft and supple, and she recoiled, banging her head on a broken rafter, sending a shower of dust down. You all right? Mr. Emsley said. Yes, she said. Are we stopped for something else? Hang on. She had once stood on a body, recognized the squashy, meat-like quality of it. She supposed she had to look, although God knows she didn't want to. She shone her torch on what seemed to be a dusty mound of material, scraps of stuff, crochet and ribbons, wool partly impacted into the earth. It could have been the contents of a sewing basket. But it wasn't, of course. She peeled back a layer of wool and then another one, as if unwrapping a badly packed parcel, or a large, unwieldy cabbage. Eventually a small, almost unblemished hand, a small star, revealed itself from the compacted mass. She thought she might have found Emile. Better then that his mother was dead rather than knowing about this, she thought. Be careful here, Mr. Emsley, she said over her shoulder, there's a baby, try to avoid it. All right. Miss Wolfe asked her when they finally emerged like moles. The fire on the other side of the street was almost out now, and the street was murky with the dark, the soot, the filth. How many? Miss Wolfe asked. Quite a few, Ursula said. Easy to recover? Hard to say. She handed over Renee's identity card. There's a baby down there, bit of a mess, I'm afraid. There's tea, Miss Wolfe said. Go and get yourself some. As she made her way, with Mr. Emsley, to the mobile canteen, she was amazed to spot a dog cowering in a doorway further up the street. I'll catch up with you, she said to Mr. Emsley. Get a mug for me, will you? 2 sugars. It was a small nondescript terrier, whimpering and shaking with fear. Most of the house behind the doorway had disappeared, and Ursula wondered if this had been the dog's home, that it was hoping for some kind of safety or protection and couldn't think of anywhere else to go. As she approached it, however, it ran off up the street. Drat dog, she thought, chasing after it. Eventually she caught up with it, snatching it up in her arms before it had a chance to run again. It was trembling all over and she held it close, talking in soothing tones to it, rather as Mr. Emsley had to Renee. She pressed her face against its fur, disgustingly dirty, but then so was she. It was so small and helpless. Slaughter of the innocents, Miss Wolfe said the other day when they heard of a school in the East End taking a direct hit. But wasn't everyone innocent? Or were they all guilty? That buffoon Hitler certainly isn't, Hugh said, the last time they had talked. It's all down to him, this whole war. Was she really never going to see her father again? A sob escaped from her and the dog whined in fear or sympathy, it was hard to say. There wasn't a single member of the Todd family, apart from Maurice, who didn't attribute human emotions to dogs. At that moment there was a tremendous noise behind them, the dog tried to bolt again, and she had to hold it tightly. When she turned round she saw the gable wall of the building that had been on fire falling down, almost in one piece, the bricks rattling onto the ground in a brutish fashion, just reaching the WVS canteen. 2 of the women from the WVS were killed, as was Mr. Emsley. And Tony, their messenger boy who had been scooting past on his bicycle, but not scooting fast enough unfortunately. Miss Wolfe knelt down on the jagged, broken brick, oblivious to the pain, and took hold of his hand. Ursula crouched down by her side. "Oh, Anthony," Miss Wolfe said, unable to say anything else. Her hair was escaping from its usual neat bun, making her look quite wild, a figure from a tragedy. Tony was unconscious, a terrible head wound, they had dragged him roughly from beneath the collapsed wall, and Ursula felt they should say something encouraging, and not let him be aware of how upset they were. She remembered he was a scout and started talking to him about the joys of the outdoors, pitching a tent in a field, hearing a running stream nearby, collecting sticks for a fire, watching the mist rise in the morning as breakfast cooked in the open. "What fun you'll have again when the war is over," she said. Your mother will be awfully glad to see you come home tonight," Miss Wolfe said, joining the charade. She stifled a sob with her hand. Tony made no sign of having heard them, and they watched as he slowly turned a deathly pale, the color of thin milk. He had gone. "Oh God," Miss Wolfe cried. "I can't bear it." "But bear it we must," Ursula said, wiping away the snot and the tears and filth from her cheeks with the back of her hand, and thinking how once this exchange would have been the other way round. "Bloody fools," Fred Smith said angrily, "what did they go and park the bloody canteen there for? Right next to the gable end." "They didn't know," Ursula said. "Well, they should have bloody realized." "Well then someone should have bloody told them," Ursula said, her anger flaring up suddenly. "Like a bloody fireman, for instance." It was first light by now, and they heard the all-clear sound. "I thought I saw you earlier, and then I decided I'd imagined you," Ursula said, making peace. He was angry because they were dead, not because they were stupid. She felt as though she were in a dream, drifting away from reality. "I'm as good as dead," she said, "I have to sleep before I go mad. I live just round the corner," she added. "Lucky it wasn't our flat. Lucky, too, that I ran after this dog." One of the rescue squad had given her a piece of rope to tie round the dog's neck, and she had hitched it to a charred post sticking out of the ground. She was reminded of the arms and legs the stretcher-bearer had been harvesting earlier. "I suppose the circumstances dictate that's what I should call him, lucky, even though it's a bit of a cliché. He saved me, you know. I would have been drinking my tea there if I hadn't gone after him." "Bloody fools," he said again. "Shall I walk you home?" "That would be nice," Ursula said, but she didn't lead him round the corner to Phillimore Gardens. Instead they walked wearily hand in hand, like children, the dog trotting beside them, along Kensington High Street, almost deserted at this time in the morning, with only a slight diversion for a gas main that was on fire. Ursula knew where they were going, it was inevitable somehow. In Izzy's bedroom there was a framed picture on the wall opposite her bed. It was one of the original illustrations from the first adventures of Augustus, a line drawing depicting a cheeky boy and his dog. It verged on the cartoon, the schoolboy cap, the gobstoppered cheek of Augustus, and the rather idiotic-looking Westie who bore no resemblance to the real-life jock. The picture was very much at odds with how Ursula remembered this room before it was mothballed, a feminine boudoir, full of ivory silks and pale satins, expensive cut-glass bottles and enameled brushes. A lovely Aubusson carpet had been rolled up tightly and tied with thick string, and left against a wall. There had been one of the lesser impressionists on another of the walls, acquired, Ursula suspected, more for the way it matched the decor than for any great love of the artist. Ursula wondered if Augustus was there to remind Izzy of her success. The impressionist had been packed away somewhere safe, but this illustration seemed to have been forgotten about, or perhaps Izzy didn't care so much for it anymore. Whatever the reason, it had sustained a diagonal crack from one corner of the glass to the other. Ursula recalled the night that she and Ralph had been in the wine cellar, the night that Holland House was bombed, perhaps it had sustained the damage then. Izzy had, sensibly, chosen not to stay at Fox Corner with the grieving widow, as she referred to Sylvie, as we shall fight like cats and dogs. Instead, she had decamped to Cornwall, to a house on top of a cliff, like Manderley, terrifically wild and romantic, no Mrs. Danvers though, thank goodness, and had started churning out an Adventures of Augustus comic strip for one of the popular dailies. How much more interesting, Ursula thought, if she had allowed her Augustus to grow up, as Teddy had done. A buttery, unseasonal sun was trying hard to nudge its way through the thick velvet curtains. Why dost thou thus slash through windows and through curtains call on us? She thought. If she could go back in time, and take a lover from history it would be done. Not Keats, the knowledge of his untimely death would color everything quite wretchedly. That was the problem with time travel, of course, apart from the impossibility, one would always be a Cassandra, spreading doom with one's foreknowledge of events. It was quite wearyingly relentless, but the only way that one could go was forward. She could hear a bird singing outside the window, even though it was November now. The birds were probably as confounded as people were by the Blitz. What did all the explosions do to them? Kill a great many, she supposed, their poor hearts simply giving out with shock or the little lungs bursting with the pressure waves. They must drop from the sky like weightless stones. You look thoughtful, Fred Smith said. He was lying, one arm behind his head, smoking a cigarette. And you look strangely at home, she said. I am, he grinned and leaned forward to wrap his arms around her waist and kiss the back of her neck. They were both filthy, as if they had toiled all night in a coal mine. She recalled how sooty they had been when she had journeyed on the footplate that night. The last time she had seen Hugh alive. There was no hot water in Melbury Road, no water at all, nor electricity, everything turned off for the duration. In the dark they had crawled under the dust sheet on Izzy's bare mattress and fallen into a sleep that mimicked death. Some hours later they had both woken up at the same time and made love. It was the kind of love, lust, to be honest about it, that survivors of disasters must practice, or people who are anticipating disaster, free of all restraint, savage at times, and yet strangely tender and affectionate. A strain of melancholy ran through it. Like Herr Zimmermann's Bach sonata, it had unsettled her soul, disjointed her brain and body. She tried to recall another line from Marvel. Was it in a dialogue between the soul and body, something about bolts of bones and fetters and manacles, but it wouldn't come. It seemed harsh when there was so much soft skin and flesh in this abandoned, in all ways, bed. I was thinking of Dunn, she said. You know, busy old fool. Unruly Sunday. No, she supposed, he probably didn't know. Oh, he said, indifferently. Worse than indifferent, really. She was taken off guard by the sudden memory of the grey ghosts in the cellar, and of kneeling on the baby. Then for a second she was somewhere else, not a cellar in Argyle Road, not in Izzy's bedroom in Holland Park, but some strange limbo. Falling, cigarette. Fred Smith offered. He lit another one from the stub of his first, and handed it to her. She took it and said, I don't really smoke. I don't really pick up strange women, and fuck them in posh houses. How Laurentien. And I'm not strange, we've known each other since we were children, more or less. Not like this. I should hope not. She was beginning to dislike him already. I have no idea what time it is, she said. But I can offer you some very good wine for breakfast. It's all there is, I'm afraid. He looked at his wristwatch and said, we've missed breakfast. It's 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The dog nudged itself through the door, its paws pitter-pattering on the bare wooden boards. It jumped on the bed and gazed intently at Ursula. Poor thing, she said, it must be starving. Fred Smith. What was he like? Do tell. Disappointing. How? In bed. Gosh, no, not that at all. I've never, like that, you know. I think I thought it would be romantic. No, that's the wrong word, a silly word. Soulful perhaps. Transcendent. Millie offered. Yes, that's it. I was looking for transcendence. I imagine it finds you, rather than the other way round. It's a tall order for poor old Fred. I had an idea of him, Ursula said, but the idea wasn't him. Perhaps I wanted to fall in love. And instead you had jolly good sex. Poor you. You're right, unfair of me to expect. Oh God, I think I was an awful snob with him. I was quoting Dunn. Am I a snob, do you think? Awful. You do reek, you know, Millie said cheerfully. Cigarettes, sex, bombs, God knows what else. Shall I run you a bath? Oh yes, please, that would be lovely. And while you're at it, Millie said, you can take that ruddy dog in the bath with you. He smells to high heaven. But he is kinda cute, she said, imitating an American accent rather badly. Ursula sighed and stretched. You know I really have had enough of being bombed. The war's not going away anytime soon, I'm afraid, Millie said. May 1941. Millie was right. The war went on and on. Into that dreadfully cold winter, and then there was the awful raid on the city at the end of the year. Ralph had helped to save St. Paul's from the fire. All those lovely Wren churches, Ursula thought. They had been built because of the last great fire, now they were gone. The rest of the time they did the things that everyone of their kind did. They went to the cinema, they went dancing, they went to the lunchtime concerts in the National Gallery. They ate and drank and made love. Not fucking. That wasn't Ralph's style at all. Very Laurentien, she had said coolly to Fred Smith. She supposed he had no idea what she was talking about, but the crude word had jarred her horribly. She was used to hearing it at incidents, it was a vital constituent of the heavy rescue squad's vocabulary, but not in the context of herself. She tried saying the word to her bathroom mirror, but it felt shameful. Where on earth did you get it? He asked. Ursula had never seen him so dumbfounded. Crichton weighed the gold cigarette case in his hand. I thought I'd lost it forever. Do you really want to know? Yes, of course I do, Crichton said. Why the mystery? Does the name Renee Miller mean anything to you? He frowned, thinking, and then shook his head. Afraid not. Should it? You probably paid her for sex. Or bought her a nice dinner. Or just gave her a good time. Oh, that Renee Miller, he laughed. After a couple of beats of silence, he said, no, really, the name means nothing. And anyway, I don't think I have ever paid a woman for sex. You're in the Navy, she pointed out. Well, not for a very long time then. But thank you, he said, you know the cigarette case meant a lot to me. My father gave it to you after Jutland, I know. Am I boring you? No. Shall we go somewhere? The bolt hole. Shall we fuck? He burst out laughing. If you want. He cared less for the niceties these days, Crichton said. These niceties seemed to include Moira and the girls, and they soon resumed their furtive affair, although less furtive now. He was so different to Ralph that it hardly seemed like infidelity to her. Oh, what a beguiling argument, Millie said. She hardly saw Ralph now anyway, and it seemed to be a mutual kind of waning. Teddy read the words on the cenotaph. The glorious dead. Do you think they are glorious? He asked. Well, they're certainly dead, Ursula said. But the glorious bit is to make us feel better, I expect. I don't suppose the dead care about anything much, Teddy said. I think when you're dead, you're dead. I don't believe there's anything beyond, do you? I might have done before the war, Ursula said, before I saw a lot of dead bodies. But they just look like so much rubbish thrown away. She thought of Hugh saying, just put me out with the dustbin. It doesn't seem as though their souls have flown. I shall probably die for England, Teddy said. And there's a chance you might too. Is it a good enough cause? I think so. Daddy said he would rather we were alive and cowards than dead and heroes. I don't think he meant it, it wasn't his style to shirk responsibility. What is it that it says on the war memorial in the village? For your tomorrow we gave our today. That's what your lot are doing, giving up everything. It doesn't seem right somehow. Ursula thought that she would rather die for Fox Corner than England. For meadow and copse. And the stream that ran through the Bluebell Wood. Well, that was England, wasn't it? The blessed plot. I am a patriot, she said. I surprise myself with it, although I don't know why. What does it say on Edith Cavell's statue, the one by St. Martin's Church? Patriotism is not enough, Teddy supplied. Do you think that really, she said. Personally, I think it's more than enough. She laughed and they linked arms as they walked down Whitehall. There was quite a lot of bomb damage. Ursula pointed out the cabinet war rooms to Teddy. I know a girl who works in there, she said. Sleeps in a cupboard, more or less. I don't like bunkers and cellars and basements. I worry about you a lot, Teddy said. I worry about you, she said. And none of that worrying has done either of us any good. She sounded like Miss Wolfe. Teddy, Pilot Officer Todd, had survived his time in an OTU in Lincolnshire, flying Whitleys, and in a week or so was due to join a heavy conversion unit in Yorkshire, and learn how to fly the new Halifaxes and start his first tour of duty proper. Only half of all bomber crews survived their first tour of duty, the girl in the Air Ministry said. Aren't the odds the same every time they go up? Ursula said. Isn't that how odds work? Not in the case of bomber crews, the girl from the Air Ministry said. Teddy was walking her back to the office after lunch. She had taken a long hour. Things were not quite as hectic as they had been. They had planned on somewhere swanky but ended up in a British restaurant and dined on roast beef and plum pie and custard. The plums were tinned, of course. They enjoyed all of it though. All those names, Teddy said, gazing at the cenotaph. All those lives. And now again. I think there is something wrong with the human race. It undermines everything one would like to believe in, don't you think? No point in thinking, she said briskly, you just have to get on with life. She really was turning into Miss Wolfe. We only have one after all, we should try and do our best. We can never get it right, but we must try. The transformation was complete. What if we had a chance to do it again and again, Teddy said, until we finally did get it right? Wouldn't that be wonderful? I think it would be exhausting. I would quote Nietzsche to you, but you would probably thump me. Probably, he said amiably. He's a Nazi, isn't he? Not exactly. Do you still write poetry, Teddy? Can't find the words anymore. Everything I try feels like sublimation. Making pretty images out of war. I can't find the heart of it. The dark, beating, bloody heart. Maybe you should write, he laughed. She wasn't going out on patrol while Teddy was here. Miss Wolfe had taken her off the roster. The raids were more sporadic now. There had been bad raids in March and April, and they seemed all the worse for their having had a bit of a breather from the bombs. It's funny, Miss Wolfe said, one's nerves are wired so tightly when it's relentless that it's almost easier to deal with. There had been a decided lull at Ursula's post. I think Hitler's more interested in the Balkans, Miss Wolfe said. He's going to turn on Russia, Crichton told her with some authority. Millie was on another ENSA tour, and they had the Kensington flat to themselves. But that would be madness. Well, the man is insane, what do you expect? He sighed and said, let's not talk about the war. They were drinking Admiralty whiskey and playing cribbage, like an old married couple. Teddy walked her as far as Exhibition Road and her office and said, I imagined your war room would be a rather grand affair, porticos and pillars, not a bunker. Maurice has the porticos. As soon as she was inside she was pounced upon by Ivy Jones, one of the teleprinter operators just coming on duty, who said, You're a dark horse, Miss Todd, keeping that gorgeous man a secret, and Ursula thought, this is what comes of being too friendly with staff. Mustache, she said, I'm a slave to the daily situation report. Her own girls, Miss Fawcett and her ilk, filed and collated and sent the buff folders to her so she could formulate summaries, daily, weekly, hourly sometimes. Daily logs, damage logs, situation reports, it was never ending. Then it all had to be typed up and put into more buff folders and be signed off by her before the folders went on their journey to someone else, someone like Maurice. We're just cogs in a machine really, aren't we? Miss Fawcett said to her and Ursula said, but remember, without the cog there is no machine. Teddy took her out for a drink. It was a warm evening and the trees were full of blossom so that for a moment it felt as if the war was over. He didn't want to talk about flying, didn't want to talk about the war, didn't even want to talk about Nancy. Where was she? Doing something she couldn't talk about, apparently. It seemed nobody wanted to talk about anything anymore. Well, let's talk about Dad, he said, and so they did, and it felt as if Hugh had finally been given the wake he deserved. Teddy caught the train to Fox Corner next morning. He was staying there for a few nights, and Ursula said, Will you take another evacuee with you, and handed over Lucky. He was in the flat all day while she was at work, but she often took him to the post if she was on duty, and everyone treated him as a kind of mascot. Even Mr. Bullock, who did not seem like a dog lover, would come in with scraps and bones for him. There were times when the dog seemed to eat better than she did. Nonetheless, London in wartime was no place for a dog, she told Teddy. All the noise, it must be terribly alarming. I like this dog, he said, rubbing the dog's head. He's a very straightforward kind of dog. She went to Marylebone to see them off. Teddy tucked the little dog under one arm, and gave her a salute, sweet and ironic at the same time, and boarded the train. She felt almost as sad to see the dog go as she did Teddy. They had been too optimistic. There was a terrible raid in May. Their flat in Phillimore Gardens was hit. Neither Ursula nor Millie was there, thank goodness, but the roof and the upper story were destroyed. Ursula simply moved back in and camped there for a while. The weather wasn't bad and in some peculiar way she quite enjoyed it. There was still water, although no electricity, and someone at work lent her an old tent so she slept under canvas. The last time she had done that was in Bavaria, when she had accompanied the Brenner girls on their BDM summer expedition to the mountains, and she had shared a tent with Clara, the eldest. They had grown very fond of each other, but she hadn't heard from Clara since war was declared. Crichton was sanguine about her alfresco arrangement, like sleeping on deck under the stars in the Indian Ocean. She felt a pang of envy, she hadn't even been to Paris. The Munich-Bologna-Nancy axis had defined the edges of the unknown world for her. She and her friend Hilary, the girl who slept in a cupboard in the war rooms, had planned a holiday cycling through France, but war had put paid to it. Everyone was stuck on the little sceptred isle. If you thought about it too much you could start to feel quite claustrophobic. When Millie returned from her ENSA tour she declared that Ursula had gone quite mad, and insisted they find somewhere else, and so they moved to a shabby place in Lexham Gardens that she knew she would never learn to like. "You and I could live together if you wanted," Crichton said. "A little flat in Knightsbridge." She demurred. That wasn't the worst, of course. Their post received a direct hit in the same raid, and both Herr Zimmermann and Mr. Sims were killed. At Herr Zimmermann's funeral a string quartet, all refugees, played Beethoven. Unlike Miss Wolfe, Ursula thought that it would take more than the great composer's works to heal their wounds. "I saw them play at the Wigmore Hall before the war," Miss Wolfe whispered. "They're very good." After the funeral Ursula went in search of Fred Smith, at his fire station, and they rented a room in a nasty little hotel near Paddington. Later, after the sex, which had the same compelling quality as before, they were rocked to sleep by the sound of trains coming and going, and she thought, he must miss that sound. When they woke he said, "I'm sorry I was a complete arse last time we were together." He went and found them 2 mugs of tea. She supposed he had charmed someone in the hotel. It didn't seem like the kind of place to have a kitchen, let alone room service. He did have a natural charm, the same way that Teddy did. It came from a kind of straightness in their character. Jimmy's charm was different, more dishonest perhaps. They sat up in bed and drank their tea and smoked cigarettes. She was thinking of Donne's poem, The Relic, one of her favorites, the bracelet of bright hair about the bone, but refrained from quoting, considering how badly it had gone down last time. How funny though it would be if the hotel were hit, and no one understood who they were or what they were doing here together, conjoined in a bed that had become their grave. She had grown very morbid since Argyle Road. It had affected her in a different way to other incidents. What would she like on her headstone, she wondered idly. Ursula Beresford Todd, stalwart to the last. "Do you know your problem, Miss Todd?" Fred Smith said, stubbing out his cigarette. He took hold of her hand and kissed her open palm, and she thought, seize this moment because it's a sweet one, and said, "No, what's my problem?" and never did find out because the siren went off and he said, "Fuck, fuck, fuck, I'm supposed to be on duty," and threw his clothes on, gave her a hasty kiss and flew out of the room. She never saw him again. She was reading through the Home Security War Diary for the awful early hours of May 11th, time of origin, 0045. Form of origin, teleprinter. In or out, IN subject, Southwest India Dock Office, wrecked by HE and Westminster Abbey, the Houses of Parliament, de Gaulle's headquarters, the Mint, the law courts. She had seen St. Clement Danes herself, blazing like a monstrous chimney fire on the Strand. And all the ordinary people living their precious ordinary lives in Bermondsey, Islington, Southwark. The list went on and on. She was interrupted by Miss Fawcett, who said, "Message for you, Miss Todd," and handed her a piece of paper. A girl she knew who knew a girl in the fire service had sent her a copy of an AFS report. A little note added, "He was a friend of yours, wasn't he?" Sorry. Frederick Smith, fireman, crushed when a wall fell while attending a fire in Earl's Court. Bloody fool, Ursula thought. Bloody, bloody fool. November 1943. It was Maurice who brought the news to her. His arrival coincided with that of the tea trolley bearing Elevenses. "Can I have a word?" he said. "Do you want tea?" she said, getting up from her desk. "I'm sure we can spare you some of ours, vastly inferior though it must be to the orange pekoe and Darjeeling and whatnot that you get in your place. And I can't imagine our biscuits can hold a candle to yours." The tea lady hovered, unimpressed by this exchange with an interloper from the airy regions. "No, no tea, thank you," he said, surprisingly polite and subdued. It struck her that Maurice was nearly always simmering with suppressed fury. What a strange condition to live your life in. In some ways he reminded her of Hitler. She had heard that Maurice ranted at secretaries. "Oh, that's so unfair," Pamela said, "but it does make me laugh." Maurice had never got his hands dirty. Never been to an incident, never pulled apart a man like a cracker, or knelt on a matted bundle of fabric and flesh that had once been a baby. What was he doing here? Was he going to start pontificating again about her love life? It never crossed her mind that he was here to say, "I'm sorry to have to tell you this," as if this were an official announcement, but Ted has caught one, I'm afraid. What? She couldn't untangle the meaning. Caught what? I don't know what you mean, Maurice. Ted, he said. Ted's plane has gone down. Teddy had been safe. He was tour expired and was instructing at an OTU. He was a squadron leader with a DFC. Ursula, Nancy and Sylvie had been to the palace, bursting with pride. And then he had asked to go back on ops. I just felt I had to. The girl she knew in the Air Ministry, and told her that 1 in 40 aircrew would survive a second tour of duty. Ursula. Maurice said. Do you understand what I'm saying to you? We've lost him. Then we'll find him. No. Officially he's missing in action. Then he's not dead, Ursula said. Where? Berlin, a couple of nights ago. He bailed out and he's been taken captive, Ursula said, as if stating a fact. No, I'm afraid not, Maurice said. He went down in flames, no one got out. How do you know that? He was seen, an eyewitness, a fellow pilot. Who? Who was it who saw him? I don't know. He was beginning to grow impatient. No, she said again. And then again, no. Her heart started racing, and her mouth went dry. Her vision blurred and dotted, a Pointillist painting. She was going to faint. Are you all right? She heard Maurice say. Am I all right? She thought, am I all right? How could I be all right? Maurice's voice sounded a long way off. She heard him shout for a girl. A chair was brought, a glass of water fetched. The girl said, Here, Miss Todd, put your head between your knees. The girl was Miss Fawcett, a nice girl. Thank you, Miss Fawcett, she murmured. Mother took it very hard as well, Maurice said, as if bemused by grief. He had never cared for Teddy the way they all did. Well, he said, patting her on the shoulder, she tried not to flinch, I'd better get back to the office, I expect I'll see you at Fox Corner, almost casually, as if the worst part of the conversation were over and they could get on with some blander chat. Why? Why what? She sat up straight. The water in the glass trembled slightly. Why will you see me at Fox Corner? She sensed Miss Fawcett still hovering solicitously. Well, Maurice said, a family gathers on occasions such as these. After all, there won't be a funeral. There won't. No, of course not. Nobody, he said. Did he shrug? Did he? She was shivering, she thought she might faint after all. She wished someone would hold her. Not Maurice. Miss Fawcett took the glass from her hand. Maurice said, I'll give you a lift down, of course. Mother sounded most awfully cut up, he added. He'd told her on the telephone. How dreadful, she thought numbly. It hardly mattered, she supposed, how one was given the news. And yet to have it conveyed by Maurice in his three-piece pinstripe, leaning against her desk, now inspecting his fingernails, waiting for her to say she was fine and he could go. I'm fine. You can go. Miss Fawcett brought her hot, sweet tea and said, I'm so sorry, Miss Todd. Would you like me to come home with you? That's very kind of you, Ursula said, but I'll be all right. Do you think you could fetch my coat for me? He was twisting his uniform cap in his hands. They were making him nervous, just by their very presence. Roy Holt was drinking beer from a big dimpled glass beer mug, great draughts with every mouthful, as if he were very thirsty. He was Teddy's friend, the witness to his death. The fellow pilot. Last time Ursula was here, visiting Teddy, was the summer of '42, and they had sat in the beer garden and eaten ham sandwiches and pickled eggs. Roy Holt was from Sheffield, where the air still belonged to Yorkshire, but was perhaps not so good. His mother and sister had been killed in the awful raids in December 1940, and he said he wasn't going to rest until he'd dropped a bomb directly on Hitler's head. Good for you, Izzy said. She had a peculiar way with young men, Ursula noticed, both maternal and flirtatious at the same time, where once she had simply been flirtatious. It was rather disturbing to watch. As soon as she heard the news, Izzy left Cornwall post-haste for London, and then commandeered a car and a fistful of petrol coupons from a man she knew in the government, to take them both to Fox Corner, and then onwards to make the journey to Teddy's airfield. You'll never manage the train, she said, you'll be far too upset. Men, she knew, was generally a euphemism for ex-lovers. What did you do to get this? A surly garage owner had asked when they filled up at his pumps on the road north. I slept with someone terribly important, Izzy said sweetly. Ursula hadn't seen Izzy since Hugh's funeral, since her astonishing confession that she had a child, and Ursula thought that perhaps she should reintroduce the subject on the drive to Yorkshire. Awkward to do, as Izzy had been so upset and presumably had no one else to talk to about it. But when Ursula said, "Do you want to talk more about your baby?" Izzy said, "Oh, that," as if it was something trivial. "Forget I ever said anything, I was just being morbid. Shall we stop for tea somewhere? I could demolish a scone, couldn't you?" Yes, they had gathered at Fox Corner, and no, there was no body. By then the status of Teddy and his crew had changed from missing in action to missing, presumed dead. There was no hope, Maurice said. They must stop thinking there was hope. There's always hope, Sylvie said. No, Ursula said, sometimes there really isn't. She thought of the baby. Emile. What would Teddy look like? Blackened and charred and shrunk like an ancient piece of wood. Maybe there was nothing left at all, no body. Stop it, stop it, stop it. She breathed. Think of him as a little boy, playing with his planes and trains. No, actually that was worse. Much worse. It's hardly a surprise, Nancy said grimly. They were sitting outside on the terrace. They had drunk rather too much of Hugh's good malt. It felt peculiar to be drinking his whiskey when he himself was gone. It was kept in a cut-glass decanter on the desk in the growlery, and it was the first time she had drunk it when it had not been poured by his own hand. Fancy a drop of the good stuff, little bear. He'd flown so many missions, Nancy said, the odds were against him. I know. He expected it, Nancy said. Accepted it, even. They have to, all those boys do. I sound sanguine, I know, she continued quietly, but my heart is split in two. I loved him so much. Love him so much. I don't know why I use the past tense. It's not as if love dies with the beloved. I love him more now because I feel so damn sorry for him. He'll never marry, never have children, never have the wonderful life that was his birthright. Not all this, she said, waving a hand around to indicate Fox Corner, the middle class, England in general, but because he was such a good man. Sound and true, like a great bell, I think. She laughed. Silly, I know. I know you're the one that understands. And I can't cry, I don't even want to cry. My tears would never do justice to this loss. Nancy hadn't wanted to talk, Teddy had once said, and now she wanted to do nothing but talk. Ursula herself had barely talked but wept continually. She had hardly gone an hour without finding the tears streaming unstoppably. Her eyes were still swollen and sore. Crichton had been awfully good, cradling her and shushing her, making endless cups of tea purloined from the Admiralty, she supposed. He didn't deliver platitudes, didn't say everything will be all right, time will heal. he's in a better place, none of that rubbish. Miss Wolfe was wonderful too. She came and sat with Crichton, never questioning who he might be, and held her hand and stroked her hair, and allowed her to be an inconsolable child. That was over now, she thought, finishing her whiskey. Now there was just nothing. A vast, featureless landscape of nothing, as far as the horizon of her mind. Despair behind, and death before. Will you do something for me? Nancy asked. Yes, of course. Anything. Will you find out if there's a scrap of hope that he's alive? Surely there's a chance, however small, that he's been taken captive. I thought you might know someone in the Air Ministry. Well, I know a girl. Or perhaps Maurice knows someone who could be definitive. She stood up suddenly, swaying slightly from the whiskey, and said, I have to go. We've met before, Roy Holt said to her. Yes, I came up to visit last year, Ursula said. I stayed here, at the White Hart. They have rooms, but I suppose you know that. This is your pub, isn't it? The aircrew, I mean. We were all drinking in the bar, I remember, Roy Holt said. Yes, it was a very jolly evening. Maurice was no use, of course, but Crichton had tried. It was always the same story. Teddy had gone down in flames, no one jumped. You were the last person who saw him, Ursula said. I don't think about it really, Roy Holt said. He was a good bloke, Ted, but it happens all the time. They don't come back. They're there at tea and they're not there at breakfast. You mourn for a minute, and then you don't think about it. Do you know the statistics? I do actually. He shrugged and said, maybe after the war, I don't know. I don't know what you want me to tell you. We just want to know, Izzy said gently, that he didn't bail out. That he is dead. You were under attack, in extreme circumstances, you may not have seen the whole sorry drama play itself out. He's dead, believe me, Roy Holt said. The whole crew. The plane was ablaze from front to back. Most of them were probably already dead. I could see him, the planes were very close, still in formation. He turned and looked at me. Looked at you. Ursula said. Teddy in the last moments of his life, knowing he was going to die. What did he think about the meadow and the copse and the stream that ran through the bluebell wood? Or the flames that were going to consume him, another martyr for England? Izzy reached out and clutched her hand. Steady, she said. I was only bothered about getting away from them. His kite was going out of control. I didn't want the bugger crashing into us. He shrugged. He looked incredibly young, and incredibly old at the same time. You should get on with your lives, he said rather roughly, and then less so added, I brought the dog. I thought you might want it back. Lucky was asleep at Ursula's feet, he had been deliriously happy when he saw her. Teddy hadn't left him at Fox Corner, instead he had taken him north, to his base. With a name and a reputation like his, what else could I do, he wrote. He sent a photograph of his crew, lounging in old armchairs, Lucky sitting proudly to attention on Teddy's knee. But he's your lucky mascot, Ursula protested. Isn't that like asking for bad luck? Giving him away, I mean. We've had nothing but bad luck since Ted went, Roy Holt said morosely. He was Ted's dog, he added more kindly, faithful unto the last, as they say. He's pining something rotten, you should take him. The lads can't bear to see him hanging around on the airfield, waiting for Ted to come back. It just reminds them that it's probably going to be them next time. I can't bear it, she said to Izzy as they drove away. It was what Miss Wolfe said when Tony died, she remembered. Just how much was one expected to bear? The dog was sitting contentedly on her lap, sensing something of Ted about her perhaps. Or so she liked to think. What else is there to do? Izzy said. Well, one could kill oneself. And she might have done, but how could she leave the dog behind? Is that ridiculous? She asked Pamela. No, not ridiculous, Pamela said. The dog is all that's left of Teddy. Sometimes I feel that he is Teddy. Now that is ridiculous. They were sitting on the lawn at Fox Corner, 2 weeks or so after VE Day. Now begins the hard part, Pamela said. They hadn't celebrated. Sylvie had marked the day by taking an overdose of sleeping pills. Selfish, really, Pamela said. After all, we're her children too. She had embraced the truth in her own inimitable way and lain down on Teddy's childhood bed and swallowed a whole bottle of pills, washed down with the last of Hugh's whiskey. It was Jimmy's room too, but he hardly seemed to count to her. Now 2 of Pamela's boys slept in that room and played with Teddy's old train set, laid out in Mrs. Glover's old attic room. They lived at Fox Corner, the boys and Pamela and Harold. To everyone's surprise, Bridget made good on her threat to return to Ireland. Sylvie, enigmatic to the last, left behind her own version of a delayed action bomb. When her will was read, they discovered that there was some money, stocks and shares and so on. Hugh wasn't a banker for nothing, that was to be divided equally, but Pamela was to inherit Fox Corner. But why me? Pamela puzzled. I was no more of a favorite than anyone else. None of us were favorites, Ursula said, only Teddy. I suppose if he'd lived she would have left it to him. If he'd lived she wouldn't be dead. Maurice was incandescent, Jimmy was not back from the war, and when he did return he didn't seem to care too much one way or the other. Ursula wasn't entirely indifferent to the snub, a small word for a rather large betrayal, but she thought Pamela was the perfect person to live at Fox Corner, and she was glad it was in her stewardship. Pamela wanted to sell and divide the proceeds, but Harold, to Ursula's surprise, talked her out of it. And it was difficult to talk Pamela out of things. Harold had always disliked Maurice, for his politics as much as his person, and Ursula suspected this was his way of punishing Maurice for being Maurice. It was all rather Forstarian, and it would have been easy to develop a grudge, but Ursula chose not to. The contents were to be divided among them. Jimmy wanted nothing. He already had his passage booked to New York and a job secured in an advertising agency, thanks to someone he met during the war. A man I know, he said, an echo of Izzy. Maurice, on the other hand, having decided not to contest the will, even though I would be successful, of course, sent a removal van and virtually looted the house. None of the contents of the van ever turned up in Maurice's own house, so they presumed he sold them, out of spite more than anything. Pamela cried for Sylvie's nice rugs and ornaments, the Regency Revival dining table, some very good Queen Anne chairs, the grandfather clock in the hall, things we grew up with, but it seemed to appease Maurice and prevented an outbreak of total war. Ursula took Sylvie's little carriage clock. I want nothing else, she said. Only to be always welcome here. As you will be. You know that. February 1947. Wonderful. Like a Red Cross package, she wrote and propped the old postcard of the Brighton Pavilion on the mantelpiece next to Sylvie's clock, next to Teddy's photograph. She would put the card in with the afternoon post tomorrow. It would take forever to reach Fox Corner, of course. A birthday card for her had made it through eventually. The weather had prevented the usual celebration at Fox Corner, instead Crichton had taken her to the Dorchester for dinner, by candlelight, when the electricity gave out halfway through the meal. Very romantic, he said. Just like old times. I don't remember us being particularly romantic, she said. Their affair had ended with the war, but he had remembered her birthday, a fact which touched her more deeply than he knew. For a present he gave her a box of milk tray. It's not much, I'm afraid. Admiralty supplies, she quizzed, and they both laughed. When she got home she ate the whole box in one go. 5 o'clock. She took her plate over to the sink to join the other unwashed dishes. The grey ash was a blizzard in the dark sky now, and she pulled the flimsy cotton curtain to try to make it disappear. It tugged hopelessly on its wire, and she gave up before she brought the whole thing down. The window was old and ill-fitting, and let in a piercing draught. The electricity went and she fumbled for the candle on the mantelpiece. Could it get any worse? Ursula took the candle and the whiskey bottle to bed, climbed under the covers still in her coat. She was so tired. Being hungry and cold created the most awful lethargy. The flame on the little radiant fire quivered alarmingly. Would it be so very bad to cease upon the midnight with no pain? There were worse ways. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Teddy's Halifax going down in flames. The only way to stop the tears was to keep drinking the whiskey. Good old Pammy. The flame on the radiant flickered and died. The pilot light too. She wondered when the gas would come back on. If the smell would wake her, if she would get up and relight it. She hadn't expected to die like a fox frozen in its den. Pammy would see the postcard, know that she'd been appreciated. Ursula closed her eyes. She felt as though she had been awake for 100 years and more. She really was so very, very tired. Darkness began to fall. She woke with a start. Was it daytime? The light was on but it was dark. She had been dreaming she was trapped in a cellar. She climbed out of the bed, she still felt quite drunk and realized it was the wireless that had woken her. The power was back on in time for the shipping forecast. She fed the meter and the little radiant popped back into life. She hadn't gassed herself after all then,